Assalamu alaikum. This is lecture 22 of web design and development, and in this lecture I am going to continue the discussion about web cookies and web sessions. So in this lecture, typical usage of a cookie and its setting will be discussed, and there will be some discussion about sessions, that how you can configure the session and use sessions in your request and response commands. So first of all, there are a number of methods in which you can get a cookie in your application. So you can get and set the cookie in three places. The first is the cookie facade, the next is the cookie method, and third one is the request and the response object. So first of all, let's look at the cookie facade, that how can you use the cookie facade to access or set the cookie. So cookie facade has a method get, and you specify the key of the cookie to get the keys, and this will pull the value of the cookie that came in with the request. So you can just run the cookie.get and then specify the name of the cookie, and this is the simplest option that you can use to get the cookie. The next option is to check whether a cookie came in with a request using the cookie double colon has method and specifying the name of the cookie, which returns a boolean, and if the cookie has a value, then it will be returned as true. So if you want to make cookies without queuing it anywhere, you can use the cookie make method, and it is the most likely to use for to make a cookie and then manually attach it to the reference object, which will be covered in a short amount of time. So here is the simplest possible way to add the cookie to the response in the Laravel. So you can call the cookie response method using the queue method. The next option is cookie global helper, and it helps to create the cookie. So you can create a cookie by calling the cookie method or cookie global helper and specifying the name of the cookie and the value or the number of values to the cookies. So in this case, a simple cookie created with the name of dismissed pop-up, and it has the attributes, it has the value true and the attribute 15. So cookies can also be created on the request and response object. So in this way, cookies come in part of the request and are also set as a part of response. And this is the simplest way to pull cookies from the request and then set them onto the response. On the other hand, the cookie facade, get, has, and queue method, which we discussed in the last slide, are just proxies to interact with the request and the response objects. So once you have a copy of your request object, you can use the request object cookie method to access a cookie from it. So you can access the request cookie helper and access the same cookie you set in the last slide. So this is a simple way to set a cookie. So when the response object is ready, you can use the cookie method to add it to the response. So this shows that you can create the cookie by specifying a cookie method, the name of the cookie and the value, and then you can attach it to the response by returning a response with a view dashboard and specifying the cookie method and the value of the cookie. There are a number of alternatives that you can use for the cookies to store small amount of information, such as you can store the small amount of information in the IP address or hidden form fields. Make a correction here that it is a form fields. You can also use to store small amount of information HTTP authentication, such as username and login passwords, and you can also use some information in identifiers for the advertisements. And there is another way of storing a small amount of information which is referred as web storage, and it can be stored in files or browser fingerprints. Apart from the cookie, sessions are also used. Session is a primary tool to store state between web pages, and sessions are a combination of a server-side cookie and a client-side cookie. So client-side cookie simply holds the value of the session named as session token that uniquely identifies the client to the server during the session, and it corresponds to the data file on the server. Therefore, when the user visits the sites, their browser sends the request code to the server, which loads the corresponding data. A session token is a unique identifier that is generated and sent from the server to a client to identify the current interaction session, and it is different for each session. The client usually stores and sends the token as an HTTP cookie and sends it as a parameter to get or post queries. So the reason to use the session tokens is that the client only has to handle the identifiers. So all session data is stored onto the server, is linked to that identifier, and that identifier is usually in a database to which the client does not have the direct access. Session has a number of advantages, and the server-side cookies can contain a very large amount of data, and it can handle it with no hassle. The client-side cookies are in limited use, therefore session is a good choice to use when you have to store a large amount of data. Secondly, session cookies on the client side contains nothing other than the small reference code, as this cookie is passed each time someone visits a page on your site. You are serving a lot of bandwidth by not transferring large client-side cookies around. Session data is more and more secure. Only you are able to manipulate it as opposed to the client-side cookies, which are editable by any of you or the third-party applications. The session configurations are usually stored in the config/session.php file, and you have to review the options available to you in this file. So by default, Laravel is configured to use the file session driver. That means it stores the session into a file, and which will work well for many applications. The session driver configuration options defines where session data will be stored for each request. Laravel ships for several great drivers out of the box. The common one is the file, and the session in files are stored in the storage/framework/sessions directory. The other option is cookie, as we discussed earlier. Sessions are stored in a secure encrypted cookies. Sessions can also be stored in the database or customized created tables in the database, and it is stored in the relational form. Sessions can also be stored in memory caches or Redis, and sessions stored in these forms have are being very fast and cache-based cache-based stores. Sessions are also used in arrays, but it is on temporary storage, and the information will not be persisted. So you can use the session by specifying a session driver. So when you use a database session driver, you need to create a table to contain the session items, and below is a schema declaration for the table. So you can create a new migration to create a session on your database, and then name the table as sessions and specify the name of its fields, and the first field is a ID, and it is a unique for each session as specified earlier. Then there is a user ID, and there is a IP address which can be null in both cases. Then there is a user agent, that which kind of browser is using, then there is a text named as payload, and then last activities counters that how many times this session has been used. So a simple note on the Redis that before using the Redis sessions with the Laravel, you will need to either install the PHP Redis extension via PECL or install the Redis package via Composer. So for more information relating to this package, you can find out the Laravel document page information and configuration information on the Redis page. So there are two primary ways of working with session data in Laravel. The first one is the global session helper and the second one is a request instance. So first look at the accessing session via the request instance, which can be type typeted on the controller method. Remember, the controller method dependencies are automatically injected via the Laravel service container. So again, the simplest way to get the session is by using the request object, and you can get the request object and access its session method to get the specific session key. So when you retrieve an item from the session, you may also pass a default value as the second argument to get method. This default value will be returned if the specified key does not exist in the session. So this can be done as the first example, that we want to access a value using the request object and the session method and a get method, and you specify the key, and if key is not present, the default value will be returned. The second example is similar to the first example, however there is a function specified for the second, and you can make a default value in the function uh, by returning a simple text value or some complex object. Similar like the cookies, you can also use the global session PHP function to retrieve and store data in the session. When the session helper is called with a single string argument, it will return the value of session key. When the helper is called with the array of the key value pairs, those values will be stored into the session. So here are the typical examples. The first example says to retrieve a piece of data from the session and is the simple way to access the value of the key from the session. Then second specifies a default value. If there is no key in the session, the default value will be provided as a to the value. Then if you want to store some value into the session, you can specify the session global helper and specify a array with the key value pairs to store the data into the session. There is a little practical difference between using the session via the HTTP request instance versus the global session helper. You can retrieve all the session data by calling the session.all method, and it will retrieve all the session information that is currently present into the session. You can also determine if an item exists in the session, and this can be done by specifying the has method of the session and specifying the key. So it will determine the key item is present in the session. You may use the has method. The has method returns true if the item is present and not null. To determine if an item is present in the session even if the value is null, you may use the exist method, and this exist method returns the true if the item is present. So you can also use the session to store data. Uh, you will typically use the put method or the session helper. Session helper was discussed in the last slide, and this shows the session put method to store some value into a session object, and this example was discussed in the last slide. So you can push to array session values. The push method may be used to push a new value onto a session value that is an array. For example, if user.teams key contains an array of team names, you may push a new value to the array. So like this example, so you can use the user done streams array with the new values called developers. So you can retrieve and delete an item as well. So you can pull the value by specifying the key, and if there is no key, you can specify the default. So you can use the flash method to flash the data, and sometimes you may wish to store items in the session only for the next request. You may do so using the flash method. Data stored in the session using this method will be available immediately and during the subsequent HTTP requests. So once it is done, the subsequent HTTP request, the flash data will be deleted. Flash data is primarily useful for short-lived status messages. So here is an example in which shows that how can you use the flash messages. So if you need to keep your flash data around for several requests, you may use the refresh method, which will keep all of your flash data for an additional request. So if you only need to keep the specific flash data, you may use the keep method, such as described in this example. This shows you can use the keep method to store have the username and email. So you can also use the delete method or flush method to delete the data. The forget method will remove, sorry, there is no delete method. The forget method will remove a piece of data from the session, and if you would like to remove all the data from the session, you can again use the flush method. So if you want to delete a particular key, you can use the session forget method, and if you want to to delete a number of keys, you can specify in an array, and if you want to delete all the data, you can use the flush method. You can also regenerate the session ID for a particular session, and it is often done in order to prevent the malicious user from exploiting a session fixation attack on your application. Laravel automatically regenerates the session ID during the authentication, and if you're using a built-in login controller. However, if you need to manually regenerate the session ID, you may use the regenerate method as described in this example. So that is end about the web sessions and web cookies. And if you're interested to read more about the subject, you can read the chapter 14 of the recommended book or some recommended titles. Thank you very much. If you have any question, you can ask me.